Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture for week 3 of juvenile justice, where we're talking about juvenile delinquency, and we're talking also about the theoretical perspectives. As I said in my announcement, apologies. This is the second time I'm recording this lecture, so please just bear with me. Apologies for any delays. Additionally, if you do hear any kind of like low fan or rumble in the background, that is just my air conditioner. I apologize. It sounds, it gets heavy sometimes, but apologies. Hopefully it doesn't pick up too much. Anyway, like I said, not in the post, but in the intro video for this week, we are going to talk about theory, and I'm telling you now, the theory part is boring. Even for me, I teach this, I enjoy this subject. Theory is not easy. It's not that it's difficult to understand, it's just there's a lot to it, and it can be boring. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me. We are going to go through it. I'm not going to spend too much time on any one theory, simply because my purposes for you in this class is for you to get a basic understanding of theory, okay? The stuff we're talking about today, I just want you to get the base level of it, okay? The other thing with this in particular is any information you need to know about each one of these theories is provided in the PowerPoint, okay? So I'm telling you this now. Anything that I'm talking about in the lecture for these theories is just to help explain it. After we get through the theory part, that's when other things come up, okay? But for the theory part, anything I'm talking about that's not on a slide is just me trying to help make sense of each theory, okay? So that the information you need for each theory is on the slide. So if you want to save yourself an extra, 30 minutes. You can jump ahead if you really want to. I do recommend, students in the past have said they like to listen to my lessons while they're cooking dinner or something like that. By all means, this is a perfect class lecture to listen to while you're doing something else, because theory is boring and you'll at least get the basics there. Okay? So, that being said, I want to talk about what the text provides first, and I'm going to tell you right now, we cover the text stuff here, and then we're going to talk about some things that aren't directly in the text and they come up later, but I want to talk about them here as well. So, our text focuses on sociological theories, and our text breaks it down in chapter 3.1 into 3 sections: social structure, social process, and social conflict. Those are the 3 categories of sociological theories that we look at here in juvenile justice. Okay? So we're going to talk about each one of those sections and the theories within each one. So the first one is social structure. And social structure holds the idea that social and economic forces in deteriorated lower class areas are what push residents towards criminal behavior. And oftentimes these social and economic forces are things like poverty, inadequate education, and limited economic opportunities. So before we even dive into the theories, social structure theory, the base for the following ones we're going to look at, believes that the choice to go into delinquency or go into criminal behavior is because of social and economic factors. So they are outside influences, but they are connected to society and the social structure as a whole. All right? So, here are our first social structure theories. So we have general strain theory by Robert Agnew, social disorganization theory, broken windows theory, and cultural deviance theory. Now, as I said, all the information that's on the slide is important, and it's what you need to know about each one of these theories. I will tell you this now. You will almost never need to know the specific names of the people who came up with the theories. They're just additional information that I provide to you, okay? That being said, let's talk about general strain theory. General strain theory holds that the disconnect between societal goals and the legal means to achieve that goal is the reason for criminal behavior, for delinquency, for juvenile delinquency. And to explain that in a slightly different way, the reason young people go to crime is because the goals that the broader society sets for them are unachievable in their current means. So, a good example is right now in our country, we see a pretty large number of individuals who are below the poverty line and people who are technically above the poverty line that cannot afford a home. Society says one of the goals of every young person is to, get married, have kids, have a home with a white picket fence, the classic American dream. But that goal is not really achievable. And so a lot of people are either having issues with that and fighting against it, or if they're still trying to do it, they might have a side hustle, and the side hustle might not be totally legal. You might sell drugs, you might steal things, you might, etc. You might go down the path of being a scammer. Those are illegal ways to achieve that same goal. You're doing it because it's the option. And so that's what general strain theory really is. The goals that society sets are unattainable in their current status. And so people look for ways to meet that, make it towards that. So, yeah, that's general strain theory in a nutshell. Like I said, the things that you need to know about each one is on the slide. I'm just trying to help explain them. So social disorganization theory holds that neighborhoods or areas that are marked by culture conflict, a lack of cohesion, a transient population, and insufficient social organizations will encourage delinquency. So very specifically, social disorganization theory says that when neighborhoods are not connected, are disorganized, they have common problems like lack of cohesion. There's not a whole group belief in the neighborhood. A transient population. The population is not there for the long haul. They're short term. There's a lack of social organization. You don't have, after school programs. You don't have a neighborhood watch, things like that. Neighborhoods marked by culture conflict. You have groups of people who do not get along living together. Yeah, you're going to see an increase in delinquency. So, pretty straightforward. And this actually comes from, very specifically, they found, Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay, this came out of their research that found that transitional neighborhoods had high crime rates. They found that neighborhoods that had these things, what they were looking at were transitional neighborhoods where, there wasn't necessarily a permanent population. It was kind of like a stepping stone thing, but they saw that there was high crime rates there. And they were trying to figure out, why does it seem that those neighborhoods have a higher crime rate than others? And so by looking into it, they found that, hey, there's a lot of these issues here. And that's what led to social disorganization theory. Okay. I'm going to skip broken windows here for just a second to talk about cultural deviance theory. Cultural deviance theory from our same people, Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay. Part of the future of social disorganization, and as they developed and looked more, they found that delinquent acts are often linked to the unique subcultures of communities where their norms and values clash with the mainstream. So they already noted that these neighborhoods have a lack of cohesion. They don't really work well together. But part of this, they also found that oftentimes people who are committing delinquent acts are actually part of unique groups. So a good example is gangster culture and street culture. They are their own unique subcultures that don't necessarily mesh with the overall mainstream culture. Mainstream culture is, follow the rules, don't rock the boat, you work and you do all this stuff, and the boring line. But then street life, gangster life is very different. They have different rules, they have different belief structures, and so, when that clash happens, you're going to see that oftentimes that means that subgroup might have a different culture that might promote things that are seen as illegal. That's cultural deviance theory. Broken windows theory is one of my favorite ones because it's one of the easiest things to understand. So broken windows theory, what you need to know, the short version is visible signs of disorder can signal a lack of care and lead to further crime and disorder. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Broken windows theory holds the idea that in a neighborhood where there are lots of broken windows, unkempt lawns, a lack of lighting, that's the perfect environment for crime, and so crime is going to happen more often there. Plain as that. If it looks like nobody cares about the environment, then it's likely nobody cares about the environment, and therefore crime happens more frequently. Because, and let's be honest, if I asked you, which place would you rather commit an illegal crime? Would you rather commit a crime in a well-lit neighborhood where lots of people are constantly at home and watching out the window and always know what their neighbors are doing? Or would you rather do it in a neighborhood that looks abandoned, like nobody cares what's going on there? If you pick to do the crime in the neighborhood where everyone's watching, you're a bad criminal. You want to go for the place where you're not going to get caught. So that's broken windows theory. And so that covers our social structures. Those are the social structure theories that our book talks about and that we're addressing here. But again, that's just looking at how society and social groups work and how that kind of influences behavior. So now we're going to talk about social process. Sometimes we call this socialization. And very specifically, social process looks at how individuals learn behaviors through interactions. And note, I even put cultural deviance fits here too. Because let's go back to cultural deviance for a second. Delinquent acts are linked to the unique subcultures of communities where their norms and values clash with the mainstream. The acts are linked to the unique subcultures. The subcultures have behaviors that they promote. So it is a social process. It has to do with the influence of other people. So that's what we're focusing on here. Previously, we were looking at societal impact and we were looking at how external factors influence. Now we're looking at how specifically relationships, how the way we bond with other people influence criminal behavior. And so, of course, we have to have things like social learning theory, social control theory, and labeling theory. Short and sweet, social learning theory is one that if you've taken psychology, you might have heard before, and you also might be familiar with the name of the psychologist behind this, Albert Bandura. So Bandura puts forward the idea that delinquent behavior, or rather any behavior, is learned by observing and imitating others within one's close social circles. That's what social learning theory is. It's the classic, if you've ever heard the term monkey see, monkey do, that's what we're talking about here. Behaviors are learned by observing and imitating those within our close circles. So we can look at it as how families interact. We can look at it how peers interact. We can look at it how friends groups interact. We can look at any of those particular groups, any specific aspect of a close social circle, and see that oftentimes behaviors are learned from those groups. So that's social learning theory. Social control theory holds the idea that delinquency occurs when one's ties to social institutions like family or school are weak or non-existent. So while social learning says, hey, You learn your behavior from your close group of friends and people that you interact with. Social control theory says, well, actually, the reason you do these things is because you don't really have a strong family connection, or you don't have a strong school connection, or you're lacking some kind of connection to a group that promotes quote unquote pro-social behavior. And when we say pro-social behavior, we mean the opposite of anti-social behavior. We're talking about positive things like being a positive influence in the overall society and group and things like that. So social control, all saying that you are missing an aspect that is supposed to be helping keep you in line. And labeling theory is interesting, and there's a reason that I want to kind of talk a little bit more about it than I normally would. So labeling theory holds that society creates delinquency through social control via labels and stigmatizing. And so this is where I'll tell you psychology and the study of the brain in particular finds that labeling theory really does play a large part. If you've ever heard of the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy, where an individual believes something's going to happen and so they end up making it happen, that's kind of the base of labeling theory. The idea is that when we use labels to identify people, especially if there's a stigma behind it or there's some kind of negative connotation, then if the individual believes it, they will fulfill that very goal that they believe that somebody else has put on them. So, for example, if you tell somebody they're worthless and they believe you when you call them worthless, they will then become worthless because they believe what you said, and because you labeled them, they will act that way. Same goes with delinquency. If you call someone a criminal and they believe you, then they're going to be a criminal because that's all that somebody views them as. That's all society can view them as. So there's a whole lot of very interesting psychology work behind labeling theory, and we do see in the juvenile justice system in particular, this does come up, particularly with education and rehabilitation. When we want juveniles to be rehabilitated and enter back into the world, we need to be careful about the terms that we're using, because if we call them a delinquent and we say, oh, once a delinquent, always a delinquent, we're furthering that labeling and we're furthering that stigmatizing, and that can lead to them re-offending. It's a whole weird, complicated balancing act, but it's important to mention that here. And that's part of that social structure. These are things that are connected to relationships with other people. But now, the third group that our textbook talks about was social conflict. And so social conflict looks at the impact that class, race, and power disparities have on delinquency. And I can tell you right now, class and race are the two big ones that we talk about, but class and race can also fit under power disparities, because oftentimes it's a power balance that is why we have issues of racism and classism and all those other isms. It tends to be a power dynamic. So social conflict is looking at disparities in power. So oftentimes we're looking at societal norms are designed by those in power to keep power by disadvantaging others. That's a common phrase that people like to talk about, and to a point it's accurate, but there's nuance to it, and I don't want to dive into that because that's not the purpose of this. But please know that when we say social conflict, our theories, we're looking at the ways we look at power struggles. And so we're going to start with relative deprivation and critical theory. So relative deprivation is the idea that the close proximity of wealthy and the poor reinforces negative feelings and hostility. So very specifically, when you put two extremes, and you can apply this to other things other than wealthy and poor, but this is the usual suspect that we talk about within relative deprivation. When you have these groups of people living in very close proximity, you find that there's an increase in negative feelings, which leads to hostility that eventually usually leads to delinquency and or criminal behavior. And it's not just one group, but it's because both groups view the other group as the problem, as the reason that there are issues, and so they wish to remove them from their area, and so they retaliate against each other, and they increase and they one-up each other, and it is a never-ending fight. That's relative deprivation. It's that close proximity. Critical theory is the broader scope of this. Relative deprivation is a very focused. Critical theory says that intergroup conflict is the cause of delinquency. So when there are groups, when there are individuals who disagree and they have conflict with one another, we see that that's where delinquency starts to show up. Why does somebody choose to steal from another person? Because, well, they want what they have. There is a conflict there. That leads to delinquency. Why do kids get in fights? There's oftentimes some kind of issue that led to that conflict. You see where I'm going with this. Critical theory is that there is an issue between two groups, two individuals, and that is what leads to delinquent behavior. As part of this, we also need to talk about choice theory, routine activities theory, and trait theory. Trait theory is our segue into the next one, but we'll get there. So choice theory is Cesar Becquerel and Jeremy Bentham, two big names in psychology that if you've taken Intro to Psych, you might have heard their names. Anyway, choice theory is also known as classical theory or rational choice theory because rational choice theory is people weigh the pros and cons before deciding on their choice. People weigh the pros and cons before deciding on their choice. Why did I repeat that? Because it's important. So, choice theory, or rational choice theory, or classical theory, in criminal justice says that the reason somebody commits a crime is a personal choice that person made. So what they did was they went, okay, I want to steal this. And they thought about it to themselves. What is the punishment if I steal this? And they went, okay, is it worth it if I still steal it? And they decide, yep, I'm still going to steal it. The punishment is not that bad. And so they proceed to steal it. They weighed the pros and cons before they decided to act. This is a basic level criminal justice theory. It's a basic level psychological criminal justice theory because it holds the idea that every single person is responsible for committing the crime they committed. Now, there is nuance, and you can add all these other things into it, but the base level is every crime that's ever been committed by any human being has been a personal choice by the person who committed the crime. And I think for the most part, I don't think it's that strange, and I think most people understand this one the best. Okay? So, that's choice theory. Routine activities theory now. This one says that there are three variables that you can identify that lead to crime being normalized in an area or neighborhood. And those three variables are a lack of capable guardian, a motivated offender, and a suitable target. 2 and 3 should be pretty obvious. The motivated offender, if a person wants to do a crime, they're going to do a crime. If a person doesn't want to do a crime, they're not going to do a crime. So motivated offender, pretty straightforward. Suitable target, easy targets, targets that are maybe not necessarily easy like marks, but they are easy to move. They're products that they can take and not struggle with too much. That's suitable target. The lack of capable guardian, this is one that gets a little more abstract. So the base level is there is no type of policing or neighborhood watch or some person in the neighborhood who kind of keeps an eye on things. That's the first thing. But a lack of capable guardian can also be a lack of police presence It can be an environment lacking street lights, so it's very dim, lots of coverage, things like that. The lack of capable guardian can simply be that the area lacks any type of protection against crime. So what we see is if there is a motivated offender and something that's worth targeting, and the neighborhood itself lacks any type of guardianship that tries to prevent crime, you're going to see crime happen way more often. And that's what routine activities theory is. It's that people are creatures of habit. We have routine activities that everybody does. And so if you notice that, hey, this area lacks capable guardians and has suitable targets, yeah, a motivated offender is going to want to go there and commit crime. That's how that works. All right. Trait theory now holds the idea that criminal behavior is not a choice, but it's about the physical and psychological traits that you have. So very much when we talk about in psychology the concept of nature versus nurture, realistically we understand it's nature and nurture. Human beings are a combination of both. They influence how we are. But trait theory holds this idea that a criminal behavior is not because you chose to, like choice theory says, but it says that some of your actual physical and psychological traits, some of the qualities of who you are biologically, play a part in this as well. And that it doesn't forgive you for what you do, but it is saying that it wasn't necessarily that you made the decision to do it. You might not have had the power to say no to it. So that's what trait theory is all about. So, biosocial theory holds this idea that the association between our biological makeup and environmental conditions have a role on antisocial behaviors. And for our purposes, antisocial behaviors are behaviors that go against societal norms and goes against the majority, and typically tend to be early warning signs of some type of problematic behavior, whether that be aggression, violence, etc. So biosocial theory says, hey, it is your biology, it is your nature, but it's also your environmental conditions, your nurture, the way you were raised, that leads to you creating or in being involved in criminal behavior. So like trait theory says it's not your choice, but you are born with it, rather. Biosocial says, yeah, you're kind of born with it, but it's also who raised you and the environment you're in, and it's not as simple as, oh, it's biology, or oh, it's an external factor. Because if you've noticed, most of our theories so far have been focused on one area. Biosocial tries to bridge a gap and say it's a combination. All right. So I'm hesitating a little bit because if you know about Freud, you either know about the current issues with Freud or you just know the past things about Freud. So for the most part, if you don't know, let me just very briefly. Sigmund Freud was a very influential psychologist in the early 1900s, is considered one of the grandfathers of psychology. He had huge influence. He did a lot of really good things. However, most of his theories, most of his concepts have been disproven. Most of his work was quackery. In other words, it was not verifiable medical science. It just kind of feelings based. And so I want to emphasize that while, yes, most of Freud's work, if not all of it, has been debunked, it did act as an initial starting point for a lot of other psychologists, and it did have a positive impact. We just now know that it's mostly bupkis. It's mostly inaccurate information. So keep that in mind. But I do want to talk about one thing that Freud puts forward that kind of plays a role, and we're going to talk about it. And that's psychodynamic theory. And so with Freud, psychodynamic theory is this idea that there are developmental personalities that every human has. And he breaks it down into a couple different ways. One of the things that he talks about as far as developmental processes is he held that people, depending on childhood, how you were raised, if you were weaned off breast milk too soon, you might have issues with that. And that's not what we're talking about. That's a whole separate part of his stuff. That's his developmental theories. But psychodynamic theory holds the idea that every person has essentially 3 personalities within them. They are the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is your basic primal instincts. It's the monkey neurons firing in your brain. It's when you see something and you immediately just have a gut instinct, you have an immediate feeling. That's the id. That's your base self. The superego is not your sense of worth, but your sense of morality that develops over time. And your superego tends to be the extreme level of right and wrong for you. So that's the side that, is the high intelligence, wants to make sure that you are a fully functioning, God-fearing member of society. And your ego is your typical everyday self. It's your balancing act, that it is your most logical self. It is the person who operates your body most of the time, who goes through life. And so for psychodynamic theory and Freud, when you do something that you would not normally do because it's a primal urge, that was your id. And when you act out of a sense of moral superiority and justice, it's your superego. But your ego is that nice middle ground. And that's psychodynamic theory. And we're actually going to come back to the id in particular because it's important to talk about here in just a little bit. Okay? But moving on to attachment theory, John Bowlby. And Bowlby, his whole research boiled down to this simple statement that emotional bonds to others are key. So attachment theory holds the idea that people need to have a bond, an emotional bond and connection to another human being. That is a key aspect of human behavior. And how we apply this in juvenile justice is that when children lack the emotional bonds to others, so being isolated from friends or peers, the family doesn't have strong emotional bonds, we see those people have issues with attachment. They do not have that sense of emotional connection, and therefore they go into criminal behavior. So attachment theory is all saying everybody needs emotional bonds that are significant and serious. And if you lack those, you are at risk of being delinquent or criminal. So that's attachment theory. Behaviorism by John Watson and B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is another big name in psychology. So if you haven't taken psychology, you're going to see Skinner's name show up again. Anyway, behaviorism is the idea that measurable events cause behavior. In other words, we learn things. We know that there are certain things that happen in our lives that act as key moments that will develop who we are. So if you are taken away from your parent at a young age, that would be a measurable event that might cause certain behaviors. That might make you a flight risk, or that might make you attached too much to somebody. So measurable events cause behavior. Social learning theory, you notice we're kind of bringing that back, is that kids model their behavior based on reactions from others. Pretty straightforward. We learn from each other. Okay? So, let's talk about cognitive theory, life course theory, latent trait theory, and trajectory theory. So cognitive theory is all this idea that reasoning and perceptions of reality and mental focus / process is what's required to understand the world around people. And so with juveniles and cognitive theory, we understand that, number one, kids are still growing and learning and developing, and so their perceptions of reality are not fully formed, and they are learning reasoning through observations with other adults and a bit of their own process. And so it's important to note that when a juvenile commits a delinquent act, it is not just we respond and punish. We have to understand what is their perception of reality. What was the reasoning that led them to this moment? If you ask a kid, why did you steal a car? Why did you get behind the wheel and drive off? How they answer, you are trying to find their reasoning and their perception of reality. And we find that, yeah, kids struggle with this. And that's the whole point of that. We want to make sure that we are addressing what are the causes. So while some of the other ones have been more identifying problem behavior, cognitive theory is used to kind of make sure that whatever rehabilitation process happens, it is being intentional. That we are understanding and trying to figure out the logical reasoning for a child's behavior. So life course theory holds the idea that delinquent behavior is a dynamic process, which means it changes, that is influenced by individual characteristics as well as social experiences, and the factors that cause antisocial behaviors change dramatically over a person's lifespan. In simpler terms, life course theory says that criminal behavior happens throughout your whole life. The influence behind you doing a criminal act will always be there. They're going to be part of who you are, and they're going to be things that come from your own life experiences. However, they won't always be the same. The idea is that over your course of your life, they're going to change. The influence for you to try drugs is not going to be the same when you're 67 years old. It's going to be very different from when you were 13. And in the same vein, the motivation behind you stealing something when you're 8 is going to be very different than the motivation to steal something when you're in your mid-20s. There's going to be differences. There still exist, but those behaviors will change over your lifetime. The influences will change over your lifetime. That's the whole point. I'm going to jump latent trait theory for a second, go to trajectory theory, then I'll come back. Trajectory theory is a lot like life course theory because they say there are multiple independent paths to a delinquent career, and there are different types and classes of offender. So the second part, throughout your life, there are different types of offenders and different types of levels of crime that you can commit. That's what they're saying in that second part. But the first part, this is where it's similar to life course theory. Much like life course saying delinquent behavior is a dynamic process, trajectory theory holds the same idea. Delinquency and criminal behavior, that happens throughout your life. But very specifically, trajectory theory says throughout your life there will be multiple times where there are going to be choices that can lead you down the path to delinquency or the path away from it. And they're going to be different. They're going to address differently. They're going to happen differently. And it is your task, your choice to decide whether or not you're going to engage with it. Trajectory theory says that, yeah, once you start, it's going to be hard, but there are multiple times where it's going to come back. There's going to be multiple times for you to get out of it, too. Your life trajectory is not decided by one action. That's the good news with that. Life course theory says, yeah, things happen and change all the time, but they're going to change throughout your lifetime. Latent trait theory is where we bring back up the id. Because human trait theory says that human development is controlled by a master trait that remains stable and unchanging throughout a person's lifetime. And this is where I say psychodynamic theory and Freud, the id, comes back here. Because latent trait theory says, yeah, guess what? Criminal behavior, it might be a particular human trait that we have. And I definitely know some students are going to be like, that seems a little weird. Why would we say that there's a master trait? And this is where I can say, yeah, it does feel weird and it doesn't feel right. But let me tell you, it is kind of true. So, not everybody agrees, but some people who do agree with latent trait theory like to believe that the master trait is something that we've identified. And I personally agree with it. It's not a thing that I would say on a quiz is the correct answer, but one of the things that we consider the master trait to be for latent trait theory is impulse control, self-control. So if you remember when I said the id comes back, the id is your primal instincts. It's your desire to just do whatever you want. That's impulse control. When we think about people committing crime, even if we hold true that it's rational choice, what choice did the person make? Did they let their impulse take over? Or was it a logical decision to commit crime? Which most people would say there is no logical reason to commit crime. So you let your impulse take control. See how that works? You can make an argument against it for sure. But for the most part, we consider the master trait for latent trait theory to be self-control. All right. So here's the good news. We finished the theory part. So thank you for anybody who has stuck through and listened to all the theory stuff. I hope I helped make it make sense to you. If not, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be glad to try and explain further some of those concepts with you. Please don't just say, I didn't understand any of it. Please be specific about what parts were confusing, because there is so much to theory. I do not want to keep just going over everything. I'd rather address things as needed. But, so, because you've finished the theory, now I do want to talk about a couple important concepts briefly here, and then we're going to get into the rest of the stuff, okay? So, the important concepts here, we have three terms I want to make sure that you're clear on. If you've taken Intro to Criminal Justice, or really almost any other criminal justice course, you've probably heard of some of these terms, if not all of them. But if this is your first criminal justice class, you're hearing them now. Again, if you've heard them before and you already know these things, well, good for you, but we're going to go over them. So there's deterrence. And deterrence is the belief that punishment will curb behavior. Punishment will change a behavior. And so general deterrence is this idea that if we have a punishment for this crime, it will stop that behavior altogether. That's general deterrence. Specific deterrence is where there's a severe punishment of a very specific crime that make people not want to repeat the illegal acts. So where general deterrence is just the punishment will stop the behavior, specific deterrence says we're not going to just try to make this work. We're going to focus only on one particular group, one particular crime, and we're going to make it super troublesome. And so this is where I get to tell you, general deterrence has a not great track record. It does not always work, but specific deterrence tends to work better. So keep that in mind. And then the last term that I want to just address here today is continuity of crime. And the continuity of crime is that after somebody engages in a crime, it becomes easier to engage in future criminal behavior. And really what this means is that early criminal involvement often leads to further future criminal involvement as one gets older. Now, there's an important concept with the continuity of crime. If the continuity of crime is that once it happens, it becomes easier, And we know that early criminal involvement leads to further criminal involvement. What does that mean for intervention? And the correct answer is early intervention can help reduce criminal involvement. And this is true. When we understand the continuity of crime is that once someone has committed a crime, it becomes easier. We want to make sure that we address people before they start committing crime so that we can hopefully stop them from ever committing crime. That's continuity of crime, baby. All right. So now, if you're following along with the textbook and the readings, now we're into Chapter 3.2. And yes, I know, it feels weird. Chapter 3.1 was all that. Like I said, Chapter 3.1 was all that theory stuff. And then I also added a couple other things that are important theories that will come up. So, let's talk about risk factors and protective factors. That's the next two slides after this as well. So risk factors are qualities that increase the likelihood of a juvenile engaging in unlawful acts. That's pretty straightforward. What we talk about when we say risk factors and protective factors is these are not, and please hear me when I say this, these are not exhaustive lists. These are not the only factors that people look at. And it does not necessarily guarantee that somebody is going to commit crime. All these are common factors for risks and for protection against or for the likelihood of criminal involvement of juveniles. Okay? So after we talk about this, we're going to play the fun game of let's test ourselves and see were we a risk. I do that tongue-in-cheek because I apply myself to it. You don't have to, but I like to draw your attention to it because you may or may not fit into it, and that's always a fun realization for students. So risk factors are the ones that are connected to an increased likelihood of juvenile engagement. And so the key risk factors that our textbook talks about and are fairly common are poor family relationships, peer influences being less than stellar, depends on the particular peer groups, economic challenges, substance abuse, that can be both the individual and family around them, as well as educational barriers. So, for Mr. Wheaton, poor family relationships, I definitely had that. Growing up, my dad left my mom in financial ruin, but also left her when I was about 5 years old. And at that time, my siblings, who are older than me, my brother left with my father, so my family was now split. And my sister, within a couple years, graduated high school and married the first guy she dated in college. So I didn't really have a family. My peer influence in school, I went to a rich kid school. I was a scholarship kid, and I was friends with some of the outcasts, so I did have some positive peer influences. But for the most part, we kind of were left on our own a lot, so, we got in some trouble, but we'll say that the peer influence was positive, so we won't count that as one against me. Economic challenges, as I already stated, my mother was left in financial ruin, and I was a WIC baby when I was young. I was a food stamps EBT kid growing up. I grew up on the Lower East Side. Anyone who's from Erie, I grew up about 3 blocks from the old East High, which is now East Middle School. I grew up when it was the high school. I grew up in the early 90s, or I grew up in the 90s, I should say, in that area. And that was not a great area. So yeah, I had serious economic challenges. As far as substance abuse, nobody in my family, I can say, thankfully, had any issue with substance abuse. My father might have been alcoholic, but again, he left when I was 5. That wasn't really an influence. However, there was a house across the street from my house growing up that was frequently raided for drugs. So there was substance abuse in my environment, just not directly. And as far as education barrier, like I said, I was a scholarship kid that went to a fairly rich kid's school. And I did fairly well in school, so we can't really hold that against me. So as far as risk factors for Mr. Wheaton, 1, 2, we'll say 2.5. We'll say substance abuse is a half one, but economic challenges and poor family relationships, I definitely had. So I had 2.5 out of 5. That's not great. But if that was the only part to this, then I think most people would be a risk factor for juvenile delinquency. Because we got to talk about the protective factors. These are the things that help decrease the likelihood of delinquency. And so these protective factors that are textbook identified and are very common are strong family bonds, positive peer relationships, academic success, engagement in extracurricular activities, and supportive community environments. And this is where I can say, despite the fact that I had poor family relationships, the family relationship that was left, my mother and myself, we formed a strong bond. So despite the fact that I came from a broken family, my bond with my mother is very strong, and I will say that was a very influential factor in my own life, in my own personal life. Not that you need to know about it, so I'm not going to dive into it, but yeah, I did have some strong family bonds with those who were around. And I can tell you right now, the peers, the friends that I made and kept close with, they were positive peer relationships. Anybody who knows me outside of this school or has had a conversation with me completely casually will know that my best friend we met in kindergarten, we're still best friends. Like, we see each other all the time. We do stuff together all the time. He's been one of the best positive influences in my life. So, yeah, I had some pretty good positive peer relationships. I'm actually friends with most of the people that I made friends with in grade school. Not so much my high school, but my grade school. As far as academic success, like I said, I was a fairly okay student. I know doesn't always fill people with the most confidence, but I was a C average student in high school. I was a slightly above C average student in undergrad and college. And then when I went to grad school, I really focused on education. I was a B to A average kid. So I did have academic success. I was not someone who struggled a lot with school. As far as engagement in extracurricular activities, from a young age, I was enrolled in martial arts. I did Taekwondo for a good decade. I did theater as a kid. I also did football as a kid. And in high school, I continued to do football and theater. And I took a break from doing martial arts, and I actually focused on dance at that time. So I was constantly involved in something. So yeah, extracurricular activities definitely happened for me. And then I definitely did have a supportive community environment. I was raised Roman Catholic. My aunt was good friends with a nun in a monastery locally here in Erie, and I actually spent a lot of my time at the monastery growing up, so the nuns were a supportive community. My church community in the church I grew up in was very supportive. They came to all of my sporting events and things because they knew I only had my mother, so a lot of them showed up to those things. So, yeah, I had a really supportive community growing up. It may not have been a family in the traditional sense, but I did have a community of people who cared. So, yeah, I had all 5 protective factors that we talked about here. And I had 2.5 of the risk factors. Simple math tells you, yeah, I definitely wasn't a juvenile delinquent. And anybody who knows me knows, yeah, I wasn't a delinquent. Did I do stupid things? Yes. Why? Because, and say it with me, people, kids do stupid things. Kids are allowed to make mistakes. And it's going to be something that we come back to in other lectures where we talk about the difference between a kid being a kid and a kid being a delinquent, because there is a difference, and that's important to remember. So, speaking of both of these things, both are important in understanding, assessing, and fixing problems. We look at risk factors and protective factors to see, number one, what might be the cause of a particular problem, and number two, how can we address it? How can we fix it? How can we make sure that it is not a problem anymore? So, for the most part, we use these in a way to try and use a formula to predict behaviors and outcomes. But I want to mention, humans are unpredictable. So, it is not always fully accurate. It is not always works. So, this is very complicated. I want to mention that. We look at it in very simplified terms because for our purposes in this class, we don't need to know the full inner workings and understand how the algorithm works and how to do this. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose is to have the discussion and understand that this is how we make those decisions. This is how we come to those decisions. And one thing that we do try to do with all this in mind is we try to be holistic. And if you've never seen that term or heard that term before, it means that we're not just addressing one thing, we're looking at everything that plays into it. Which is why, looking at the risk and protective factors, we're not looking at just one thing. We're looking at family, we're looking at peers, we're looking at school, we're looking at extracurricular, so things outside of school, we're looking at community. Like, we're trying to address multiple components. Because if we only look at one area, we're going to have gaps, and it's not going to be accurate. So, how do we identify at-risk youth? Obviously, we have the risk factors and protective factors. We can look at that, but there's other things that we can do to identify at-risk youth. So, I do want to say real quick before I dive into this that early and repeated intervention works. Okay? I know it feels out of place, and it's because I don't really have a place to put it, but I just want to mention that when we talk about interventions, when we talk about programs, which we're going to continue to talk about now from this point forward, it's important to note that early and repeated is what works best, which again goes back to the continuity of crime concept that I introduced. Anyway, so how do we identify at-risk youth? Well, we can look for behavioral signs. And behavioral signs are obviously things that we can visually see, but we understand, these are things like aggression, defiance, skipping school, and even early substance use. Now, again, all of this should be taken with one important grain of salt in mind. Teenagers are emotional beings. Honestly, I want you to think about this yourself and ask this to yourself. How often can a teenager be defiant? How often will a teenager want to skip school? These are normal things, but it's important to note that while it is a normal behavior, if we see it happening frequently, that's a potential early warning sign. Okay? So, yeah, a level of aggression is normal because puberty changes all of your chemicals in your brain and everything. So, yeah, aggression might happen. But when is it just hormones and when is it a early warning sign of at-risk youth? So, again, it's complicated. Some social indicators we're looking for things in peer groups and whatnot. So, we identify this by looking for frequent conflict with peers or frequent conflict with adults and feelings of isolation. And I do want to highlight the feelings of isolation. So there is a normal level of feeling of isolation when you're a teenager and hormonal and everything, but if an individual is feeling serious levels of isolation, that is a very clear early warning sign of either depression or some kind of delinquent behavior. Because oftentimes if somebody feels like they're isolated, they're no longer part of a social group, if that group was important to them, they might do just about anything to be back in with that group, even if that means criminal behavior. So it's important to take that seriously. Environmental factors are pretty straightforward. They're things like living in high crime areas, experiencing home life instability, family disputes, or even financial troubles, personal or family financial troubles. They're the factors outside of the child's control or the juvenile's control that influence pretty much every part of their life. And then there's academic performance. A lack of interest in school, while sometimes pretty normal for kids, it's the outside of that normal lack of interest. And this one is a really good warning sign because it's connected to a lot of research on this, but dropping grades. If you see a change in grade in a student, like if you have a straight A student that starts getting C's, that's a very clear warning sign of some at-risk problem, whether that be depression, whether that be environmental problems at school with social groups. It could be criminal behavior. It could be any number of things. But if you see a significant drop in grades, it's something that needs addressed in one way or another. And like I said, we're going to talk way more about it. We're going to talk about it here in just a little bit, but we're also going to talk about it in future lessons. There's been a whole lot of research done on education, and we find that education is a key to success. And I don't just mean for high school students, I don't just mean for college students, I mean even for rehabilitation for offenders. Education is the key. There's been so much research, and it shows that academic success is deeply connected to lower criminal rates and true just general success. So, well, again, we'll get to that here in a little bit. But components of programs that work. So, I'm shifting gears a little bit, and I want to talk about. We've addressed this already. That you have a project due at the end of the semester. You have a program proposal project. Well, your program proposal can be on just about anything. You can do an after-school program. You can do just a youth center program. You can do a community-run program. You can do a juvenile detention program. You can do whatever kind of program you want. But our textbook talks about this, and I thought, holy crap, we do a project on it. This would be a really good idea to focus on. And so what we know is we looked at, our textbook has identified, several programs that are successful, and they identify that there are 4 components of juvenile delinquency programs that tend to work. So when these 4 components are present, the programs tend to be more successful. So those 4 components are accessibility, comprehensiveness, cultural relevance, and type appropriateness. Hint, hint, if you want to do well on your program proposal project, this might be an important slide to think about. So accessibility is literally location, time, and affordability. So in a lot of the programs that have been analyzed by experts over the years, they've found that the physical location of a program does matter. If it is in a central location that is easily accessible to most people, it tends to have the most success rate. If you put it in an isolated location or somewhere that requires a lot of travel time, the program tends to be less successful, either through lower enrollment or dropout rates. We also know that the time that goes into the program also matters. You can't make the program something that only runs every hour, once an hour for 15 minutes on one day a week. No, you need to have flexibility with time. There needs to be multiple times that can be met. Same with location. You might need multiple locations. But the idea is that these are things about accessibility that should be met for a program to be considered a successful program. And the third part of accessibility that a lot of people don't tend to think about right away, but is important, is affordability. It's important to remember about criminal justice and criminal behavior in general. Poverty does not cause criminal behavior, but a lot of criminal behavior is connected to poverty. So if you're trying to create a program that's meant to help reduce juvenile delinquency, you need to consider its affordability. Can a parent of 5 kids afford to send their kid who might be a problem kid who could be involved in delinquent behavior? Can they afford to send them to the program? This is something to consider. Comprehensiveness comes back to that holistic design. We want it to be well-rounded that addresses multiple components. So what they found is that in a lot of programs that are really successful, they do try to do a holistic approach. They try to address cultural issues as well as emotional issues, behavior issues, physical issues, dietary issues, all that stuff. And yeah, I said dietary, and if you thought that's weird, not really. Food stability is a pretty big factor in some levels of delinquent behavior. So there's a whole host of science on that one. So yeah, comprehensive. You try to wrap in as much of their life as possible so that it's addressing as many of the issues as they can. Now, obviously, you don't want to run yourself too thin, but a good program will try to address as much as they can. The cultural relevance is twofold. One is that it's not isolating towards another group. In other words, it's not solely focused on one group of people so that only that group can partake in the program. You want it to be something that is universal enough that anybody can take part in it. However, it also needs to make sense. It can't be, oh, we're going to have a group of inner city kids working in a Islamic mosque, working for the mosque itself on labor things. Well, why? What's the relevance behind it? If it's to teach responsibility, and then that's a different story. But if you're just doing it because, well, that's what's available, that's what's nearby, that doesn't quite work. Cultural relevance means that it's, number one, open to everyone, but number two, it's relevant to who you're addressing and what their needs are. And then last but certainly not least is type appropriate. And this is where I say, is the program family-based or is it school-based? Is it community-based? Those bring with them different issues. So, for example, most school-based programs focus on peer mentoring and good modeling of behaviors. Whereas a family-based therapy tends to focus on communication skills and healing. So if you are trying to do a program that's a school-based program, and you're trying to do family therapy in a school program, it's not really going to work. There's going to be problems there because they're two different goals and they're two different styles and designs. So that's what we mean when we say that. So you notice there's a fifth thing on this page, a fifth bullet. And that's, if the community doesn't support, it won't be anywhere near as effective. And that's where I get to tell you, this is the sad reality of corrections in our country right now, in general. There's other things to be talked about, but this is one of those pieces. And it's very relevant to juvenile justice in particular. Rehabilitation, which is the re-release of individuals into society, if the community is not willing to work with that group, it's not going to be effective. And so for any type of rehabilitation, whether for adults or kids, if the community itself doesn't want to support it, it will not be as effective as it can be. This is one of those things that we know is true. This is a fifth component of programs that work. But the problem is, this is a component that, unfortunately, the program can't control. It's something that's reliant on the community at large. So, keep that in mind. And now we've come to the last slide, school. And in my notes book, I have school ... Because school is a major influence on a juvenile's life. If you've never thought of it before, I ask you to take a second now and think, how long have you already spent in school? How long have you spent in school? If you grew up here in the United States and you went to school here in the United States, if you started in kindergarten, we'll just assume you start in kindergarten, and you go all the way through high school, up through senior year, that's 13 years of school. And if you also went to school here in the United States and here in Pennsylvania, pretty much any state except for like Arizona and some parts of California, you went to school for 9 months out of the year, roughly, because you had summer off. So for 13 years, you spent over half of the year in school. You spent 3/4 of the year in school. That's a lot of time. And so it's important to note that school is a huge influence on kids because kids spend a majority of their life up until that point in school. So it's important to just say that first, is that school has a huge influence, and it is actually, in my humble opinion, it is their responsibility to consider the long-term effects that they will have on any juvenile in their system. So, now shifting back into talking about programming. So, for an effective school-based program, the school needs to create an environment that is not just about academic success, but one that is supportive, that makes students feel safe and like they belong. So this is it's similar to the phrasing in the chapter, but it's important to note that we do understand that school-based programs, they can't just be focused on academic success. They have to actually be a safe environment for kids to learn the proper tools and the proper ways of handling behaviors and things like that, which is why, again, talking about peer mentorships and whatnot. So, it comes down to 3 things that we identify for effective school-based programs, and that's that the juvenile feels respected, valued, and safe. We already know that when kids feel safe, they're open and honest about things. They reveal more about themselves. When kids feel respected, they tend to show respect back, and they also feel better. And when a kid feels valued, they tend to do better. If a kid feels like they are valued, they will perform better. These are simple things, but this is the important part that is missing. And I even have in my notes, go figure, promoting respect and diversity shows an overall decrease in delinquency. And this is the reality. Respect and diversity, real diversity and real respect, is directly tied to a decrease in delinquency. Respect is an important component of being a functioning member of society. And I have in my notes here, and I want to emphasize this, people aren't born racist. They learn it. And it can be unlearned. People aren't born racist or sexist or ableist or anything like that. Heck, a 4-year-old will be brutally honest with everybody. They're not born hating another group of people. That's something they learn from their environment. And so, again, respect and diversity decreases delinquency. So we find that fostering diversity and respect teaches empathy, which is what builds stronger social communities and bonds, that reduces the concept of othering, and as a result, reduces many types of crime. Because a good number of crimes tend to be based on issues of power dynamics, again, between groups of people. So, another thing that we have found also related to crime is that when one has sufficient support and resources, the need for crime tends to disappear. When you provide a stable, safe environment, there's less of a reason to commit crime. That's just kind of the way it works. So, yeah, I wanted to bring up some of those things. I do want to say about the respected, valued, and safe. It's definitely not perfect, and some places do it absolutely terribly. And if you went to a school that did it terribly, I apologize. Not that I had any power over it, but I apologize because this is a problem in general. Anti-bullying programs in schools are schools' attempts to create an environment of respect, value, and safety. However, a lot of those programs don't work, and it becomes a whole mess, and I'm not diving into it, but I wanted to at least mention that here. All right. So the other thing that I want to talk about is connected to specifically after-school programs, and that is that there is a connection between academic success and reduced delinquency. What we find is that most students who perform well in school, who are active in their school environment, and I don't just mean like goody two-shoes, I mean like kids who just get involved in some way, shape, or form, even if it's with the football team or the soccer team or the baseball team. The idea is that when there is connections to the school and the kid is doing well in school, the likelihood that they're going to commit a delinquent act is a way, way, way reduced. Again, kids normally do stupid things, teens do stupid things and get in trouble, but general real delinquency, being involved in gang activity or real drug activity, that's not common when a kid is doing well in school and is engaged in multiple activities. This is why we say there is a connection between academic success and reduced delinquency. And part of that is academic success does teach kids a little bit about respect and dignity. So keep that in mind and take that as you will. But that being said, that's the end of the lecture. You made it to the end. I told you if you stuck with it, it would get easier and it'd be more interesting to talk about. I want to emphasize, just because we've went through the theory doesn't mean we're done with it. We will bring up the theories from time to time, but we will not dive deep like we did this time. We won't go over all of them again. But that being said, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.